song says, God will make a way for you.
Yes, amen.
You are
and to look forward as well to the future. I want to encourage you to turn with me to 1 Chronicles chapter 22. As David was preparing to die, he left a charge for his son Solomon. Build the temple for the Lord. Chronicles 22, verse 11 through 13. He says, "Now, my son, the Lord be with you, and may you have success and build the house of the Lord your God, as he said you would. May the Lord give you discretion and understanding when he puts you in command over Israel, so that you may keep the law of the Lord your God. Then you will have success, if you are careful to observe the decrees and the laws that the Lord gave Moses for Israel. Be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid or discouraged."
We can't find the verse. We can't remember.
2 Chronicles 11.
No, First Chronicles.
First Chronicles, I'm sorry. 22, 11 through 13.
Okay.
Yes. And unfortunately, the Bible reads the whole chapter to you.
Yes.
You can't just read one section in those things. I understand. Just as the transition was beginning from the tabernacle to the temple was not an easy one, so we're transitioning. For the nation of Israel, the tabernacle is what the nation of Israel had known for almost 1,000 years. From the time of Moses to the time of David is almost 1,000 years. And for all of that time, they had been worshiping God in a tent. Now, it was a fancy tent. It was a sturdy tent. But they had been worshiping in this structure that was mobile, that had moved with them for 40 years in the wilderness, and then had come into the promised land and had found a stable home for many generations. And David is the first one to move it to Jerusalem. And then he said, "I have a great home, a home made of wood and of blocks, bricks, but the house of the Lord is still in a tent." His desire was to build a grand temple for the people of Israel to come and worship God, but God told him that he would not be the one to build it because he had been a man of violence. But his son would build it. His son, who would reign over peace, would build it. Solomon was going to build that. And then in 2 Chronicles chapter 6, verse 18, at the time of the dedication of that facility, that grand temple, ornate, gold throughout, inside and out, Solomon makes this statement, 2 Chronicles 6:18. "But will God really dwell on earth with men? The heavens, even the highest heavens, cannot contain you. How much less this temple I have built?" God gave Solomon wisdom and understanding, and though he had built what was at that time one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, he recognized God could not be contained in that place. That building, or any building, cannot contain the wonder and the glory and the power and the presence and the Spirit of God. The first Church of God was founded in 1909 through a series of revival meetings held in the city. Of course, the city was much smaller then. The boundaries of the city didn't go as far as they do today. But it was not until 1912, 3 years, that the congregation had its first building. thanks to a gift from Mrs. Emmy Trammell, the Pond Church was erected at the corner of 7th Street and 11th Avenue. See the picture of them gathered in front of the building that was erected there at that location. It was called the Pond Church because of its proximity to the pond, which held the logs awaiting processing at the sawmill. Now Sawmill Square Mall, then it was still a sawmill. And the pond extended all the way up through to Daphne Park. And the creek fed the pond and floated the logs down to the sawmill. And just up on the hill above that, where today, Michelle, if you'll switch the picture, where today the Department of Corrections has a building. I don't know if you can see this or not, but this is the location. This is 11th, that's 12th, and this is 7th. And the Department of Corrections has a building up there. I think that's not a prison. Google says it's a prison. I think it's actually where probation and parole are housed, because it's just a little office. But behind that is an oil field site, and then Hendricks has expanded, and they have in this section. This is the Quality Inn and Suites, formerly the Laurel Hotel and Conference Center, and here is Chancellor's, and then back here is Hudson. So that's the first location for the Church of God, and they called it the Pond Church. I don't know if that was the name on the building. It's probably just said the Church of God, but they called it the Pond Church while they were there. In 1928, then 17 years later, the congregation purchased a building from the Seventh-day Adventists and moved to a new location at the corner of 3rd Avenue and 13th Street. Now this is picture is after the first transformation was made to the building. The original building was a one-story building sitting on the ground with just a crawl space underneath it. And the very first thing they did was to jack up the building and excavate the basement and add a basement underneath. And this is the result of that. They stepped up into the building, and then there was a basement underneath. But it's a wood frame building, and they were called at that time the 3rd Avenue Church of God. Another project brought the addition of bricks to the exterior, and still another added a 2-story front to the building and a 2-story back to the building with classrooms. Until 1949, it was called the 3rd Avenue Church of God, and then the name was changed after the brick went up to the First Church of God, Laurel, Mississippi. And Michelle, just roll back for just a second to the first slide at the Pond Church, because there's something very important, another transition that happens that is very important in the Church of God history. One more.
Sorry.
You're all right. Notice the men in this picture. None of them have on ties. And then roll forward to this one, and nearly all of them have on ties. And if you go to the next one up close, you can see that the little ones, the young men didn't, but the older men had on jackets and ties. And that, hence the necktie controversy in the Church of God, whether or not neckties were putting on airs. In the early church, they didn't wear ties because that was what uppity city folks did. And then they became uppity city folks, I suppose, and started wearing ties to church. It's just interesting that there in the history of the buildings is that little controversy. The First Church of God met at that location at 3rd and 13th for 44 years before relocating. And that building at 3rd and 13th is still used as a church today. the folks who bought it from our congregation are still meeting there. And it still looks exactly like that, except that the neon sign, the very first neon sign for a Church of God in Mississippi, we also had the very first organ for the Church of God in Mississippi. That neon sign is gone. Obviously, I'd love to have that sign. That would be a cool piece of history to have with the neon that hopefully still works. That would be fun. But it's still there and still being used on a regular basis for people of God to meet. Just not the Church of God, Anderson, Indiana.
It's Parkview. The Parkview Church. The church that says Parkview.
No,
That's not it?
no,
Oh, okay.
I don't think so. It's yeah. There may be, is there one more picture?
I just thought it was Real Mercy.
Is there, did we do the map? Did I do the map? No. In the 1950s, new property was purchased at the corner of 17th Avenue and General Pershing. Now that's down the hill in the neighborhood. 17th Avenue and General Pershing. Completion of a beautiful new parsonage was finished in 1957, and plans were made for construction of a new building that would encompass the entire block between 17th Avenue and 16th Avenue, very near what was still the stockyards at that time. I'm not sure why you would ever want to live. That's right. This house is right across the street from where the stockyards were. I don't know why you want to live that close to the stockyards. But they said about this building, this is just after completion, the top picture black and white. And this is the Google map photo of it today, how it looks. I think it doesn't actually look that good. I think it's actually boarded up because the owner of that property lives in Georgia. And her son was living in it, but he was doing drugs in it, and she kicked him out, and she's boarded it up. But they said at the time, 1957, that it was the most beautiful parsonage in the entire state of Mississippi, again, for the Church of God. And it's on 2 lots. You can see the depth of the front yard. It's actually on 2 lots. And then to the left is where the church facility was going to be. I was looking for, I've seen it somewhere in the files that they had mock-ups and drawings made of that building that was going to be built, and the maps outlining it, and I couldn't find them. I was going to show you guys that. But they never built, though they built that parsonage, they never built that facility down at 17th and General Pershing. This was in the 1950s. In 1963, there was a hard push for the congregation to build at that location, but it was determined to be too costly. And in fact, I think it wasn't until 66 that the church burned the last mortgage on the existing building and started accumulating money for what then would be a shift to property located adjacent to the new I-59 expressway and on the newly refurbished Grandview Drive. I didn't realize this, but before the expressway came through, as I was talking to one of the surveyors, Grandview Drive used to run just on the opposite side of the fence, and then curved around and came into 16th Avenue about where the bridge is for 16th Avenue, right before you get to Jefferson. So it was a winding road, and then the expressway came in, and they built Grandview down this way. Didn't exist back in the 50s. By 1966, the focus had shifted, and the congregation broke ground in June 1971 and completed construction in November of 1972 in what Reverend Raymond Horn, pastor at that time, called a completely new church building. It was built from scratch, and everything in it was brand new. Out in the foyer in the narthex on the table are the items from behind the cornerstone. And it includes pictures taken. I think some of these pictures are included there. The next picture is not included there, but includes the picture of everyone who was there for the dedication ceremony. And then the programs or the bulletins for the week before they moved here, the week that they moved here, and then the dedication service a couple of weeks later, and then the dedication of the cornerstone a couple of weeks in December after that. So all of those things took place. And then there should be an aerial map of our location now, showing where we are with applied technology and Lawson out front, and then all of the space next door to us. That's also included in the new plat that will become the Autoplex here. The church grew to a high point of 132 in attendance for Sunday school in 1985. I can't imagine, having never seen what this building would look like with 132 people in Sunday school. Can't imagine what that must have looked like. Some of you still remember that. Having this building full of people, and then worship service following with that many. In 2005, this building was ravaged by winds and rain from Hurricane Katrina and remodeled at a cost of $500 million in insurance funds. Over the years, various entities have sought to locate new businesses and frontage roads through our property for the purpose of economic development. But finally, in the summer of 2019, the congregation, now of less than 50 persons, recognized needed a new type of ministry and offered 5.4 acres for sale on the open market. And the contract was agreed upon by the leadership and then the General Assembly in March of 2020. The Church of God has had a presence in the city of Laurel for 111 years. And during that time, it has owned just 3 buildings, 4 properties, but just 3 buildings, where it met for worship, for fellowship, and for discipleship. This year, 2020, marks a change. In this year, there will be a 5th property, 4th building, and a new direction that will be forged that will hopefully guide the congregation to new life, to ministry, to impact in the culture and the community. And our prayer is that God would guide us into the next season of congregational life and inspire us for the next 50 years of ministry or until His return, whichever comes first.
Amen.
And there's the aerial photo of 1st Street and 12th Avenue. And so, to conclude today, to recognize that God has always been moving people forward, moving them in new directions. It is not, we're not the only ones to have been through this. Generations before us did this. A generation before them did it. And the one before them did it as well. We have been here for 47 years, 48 years nearly. And that's a long time. But it seems that the time has come to celebrate all that has happened, all that has transpired, all of the lives that have been changed, all the families that that have come and gone through these doors, but also to celebrate that God is still at work, that He's still calling us forward, challenging us to make a difference in our generation. Would you join me in praying for wisdom, for thanksgiving, and for divine guidance? It urges us to keep coming to the cross. Lead us to the cross. Go in peace